Warmly welcome to this session on reconstruction of Ukraine and the future of Europe. And we will spend the next 75 minutes together discussing this topic. And we also, this session is also co-hosted by Dice, and Matteo will say a couple of words of that later. I who will moderate this session, my name is Fredrik Löjdqvist, and I'm director of Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, based at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, UI. And we have existed for a little bit more than a year and a half now, and we are currently working very intensively with the Swedish government on supporting them with policy recommendations for a new policy on Eastern Europe in view of the Swedish presidency. And of course this includes EU enlargement, reconstruction of Ukraine, military, other security support, holding Russia accountable, and the future of Eastern Partnership. So this comes very, very timely, and of course this is the topic of the day. We started this conference with the topic on war in Europe, and that's where we are. This changes everything, and there's no going back. There is no status quo ante before February 24th. We are out of the comfort zone. A new Europe is created, whether we like it or not, and we see history in the making in front of us. How we respond or not respond to the Russia crisis that we're facing will not only shape the future of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe for the coming generation, but it will shape the future of the EU, the Europe as a whole, and the European project. Russia's success or failure will be decisive, and Russia's failure is, of course, Ukraine being successful, becoming a modern, sovereign country, modernized European country in line with European values, norms, and standards. However, if Russia succeeds, if Russia's military aggression, unparalleled since the Second World War in Europe, bears any kind of fruit of aggression, if Moscow, the Kremlin, can draw the conclusion that military violence is a successful tool to achieve its political tools, well, then we will live in a totally different Europe. And that will be a lethal blow to the European security order and Europe as we know it. And a lot of these discussions we have here will become more theoretical about European reform and so forth. So very much is at stake. Our support to that end, be it macro-financial assistance, humanitarian support, military support, reconstruction, will cost money. And this comes at a time when we are facing an economic recession, high inflation rates, and high interest rates. So this can very much be perceived as a burden, a cost, an unnecessary and unwelcome cost. But I think, and I will make the argument, that this should be seen as an investment in the future of Europe, and also holding the possibility, the vision of a Europe whole, free and at peace at the end of the corridor or the tunnel. And we also have to ask ourselves, what are the opportunity costs? What are the alternatives for getting this right? What will be the cost further down the road if we do not succeed with Ukraine? So, reconstruction of Ukraine is very, very and intimately linked to the future of Europe. And to discuss this topic today, we have our panel, which consists of Nonna Michelidze, who is a senior fellow at the Istituto Affari Internazionale in Rome. And then Matteo, also from the senior fellow, also from the Istituto Affari Internazionale in Rome. Svetlana Chekunova, who is a leading expert, energy expert at the Razumkov Center, currently based in Denmark. And Torbjörn Becker, who is the director of the Stockholm Institute for Transition Economies. The questions, sort of guiding questions for this session, is what the role of the EU in the reconstruction of Ukraine will be or should be, and also in relationship to other donors and key players. How is the reconstruction of Ukraine linked? What is the relationship between reconstruction and the EU approximation of Ukraine? Can one think, have the one without the other? Will there be reconstruction without the membership perspective or a sort of European perspective for Ukraine? How can the necessary resources be mobilized, and how will this affect EU budget? And what does reconstructing Ukraine into a prospective EU member, what does it mean and what does it entail? And also a big question, what would an Ukrainian EU membership eventually mean for the future of EU? It will be a different Europe. Not least important, it is the energy aspects of this. What does the reconstruction of Ukraine and its EU approximation mean for energy markets, energy production and transmission, energy security, resilience, and the integration of European energy, both for Ukraine itself, but also for the Union as a whole. And this also, of course, includes the question of decoupling from Russia. And finally, what role does the concept of differentiation, how should we think in terms of differentiation, both of EU's external policies in relationship to the countries in the Eastern Partnership, but also in the internal policies mean for the approximation of the three association countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. The panelists will make some introductory remarks trying to address some of these questions, and then we will have a sort of moderated discussion, and then we will open up for questions and comments from the floor. But Norna, we start here from left to right. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the introductions. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Actually, I wanted to start what Richard was saying in the previous panel, namely that over the years there have been many criticism and a lot of negative literature with the negative assessments on EU's democracy support in the new neighborhood. But we have also the success story, and I think that the story of Ukrainian resistance and the story of the resilience of the Ukrainian society just proves the success of the European neighborhood policy, of the European democracy support in the region. Because when the Ukraine was granted with the EU candidate status, many thought that it was kind of the emotional reaction of the EU towards what was happening. Actually, I think it was a decision based on the assumption that Ukraine is not a failed state, even if there were some grounds to think so, that it has done a serious homework during the 8 years, and since especially 2014 when Ukraine signed association agreements with the EU. Several of these things helps Ukraine now to resist the brutal aggression of Russia. So what has been done so far? One of the most important things, I think, it was a kind of fiscal restraint and moving over the 10% of GDP budget deficit to 2%, redirecting to different sectors. 5%, for example, went to the military budget, and this made possible for Ukraine to survive, especially the first 2 months before receiving the Western help and Western weapons in order to resist to the invasion. The second most important issue was the fiscal decentralization, the money going from central budget to the local communities, which contributed to strengthen local resilience. And now we see these brave mayors in different regions of Ukraine resisting the invasion. This is thanks to the reforms which were included into the association agreement. Another serious reform was about the sovereign debt, about the banking sector, and then we have all the measures implemented in direction to better the transparency and efficiency of the political systems. There were things like Presura, which is a procurement system, e-budgeting, which gave the possibility to the civil society representatives to have a look how the government was doing budget and how the money was spent consent to different provisions. And then recently there has been this GIA application which provides civil services to the citizens in order not to make the lines and to get all the services online. And if we think about all these measures, then we understand that they entail in themselves also kind of anti-corruption mechanisms. Now, all the decentralization issues that the local authorities have no more to look at the center and to pay some bribes in order to get money, or the local citizens to get some services. These all are kind of steps further into successful anti-corruption measures. Of course, there are a number of challenges. There is judiciary reform to be done. There is other anti-corruption reforms to be implemented, but we have also to admit that judicial reform, it's not about the technicality. It's a political reform. I mean, because changing judicial system, this means that you are changing power structure in the society, in the country, and it will take times. I'm speaking about the reforms because when we think about the reconstruction of Ukraine, we think to reconstruct also its governance. As said, up until now, international community provided substantial, enormous military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine. Ukraine has to win the war, but it has to win the peace after the war. And if Ukraine manages to do both, then it will often enormous geopolitical importance also for the EU. But before to come to reconstruction, we have to help Ukrainian economy to keep going on, and with the foreseen 30% GDP constraint, Ukraine needs at least 5 billion per month, which for now is provided by the US and the EU. And speaking about the reforms, despite the war, the reforms have to be implemented, because then it would be kind of the confidence building measure also between Ukraine and the private sector, who should be one of the leading actors in post-war reconstruction. But there is a need also another guarantees, not just from Ukraine, but from international community for private sector in order to feel themselves motivated to invest in Ukraine, maybe from World Bank or from some G7 countries, but private sectors themselves should see this action not just an assistance to post-war country, but as an opportunity also for their businesses, because Ukraine is a country of enormous economical importance, and with well-qualified, highly skilled people, young generations, and there have already been serious international companies operating in Ukraine, like Google, for example, investing a lot in digital space because of this well-skilled young generation in this space. Beyond private actors, there are talks about whether we can use Russian money in order to rebuild Ukraine. The West has frozen Russian assets. Ursula von der Leyen 3 days ago, she announced that EU wants to establish kind of platform and to study how to confiscate and to transfer this money to Ukraine. Please don't ask the question how, because I don't know, because there are a number of legal restrictions, and there are also a number of political and financial restrictions or interest, because also in the US there are a lot of talks about confiscating Russian central bank reserves, which has been frozen by the US. But Federal Reserve already said that if we confiscate these reserves and transfer this Ukraine, this will be kind of negative signal to China, because China is enormously investing in dollars, and such a signal then would maybe cause China decreasing its investment, and this in turn can hit the dollar. So all the challenges regarding this we have ahead, and we have to think about the mechanism, how to face it. Very last first, I think every effort from the international community should be well coordinated, and there should be one single platform which manages all the reconstructing plans and idea towards Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Matteo, please.
Thank you, Frederick. I'm here today to represent one essential component of the DICE project that was led by my institute, Istituto Affari Internazionali, on mapping on a scenario of future differentiated integration within the EU and across Europe. And I will try to answer some of your questions, in particular the one on the role of differentiated integration and the future of Ukraine and the future of Europe, in light of our results. And that, by the way, we will publish in a policy paper next week, so the final result of this part of work of DICE. Just two brief comment on the paper and on the work done within DICE. This work on a scenario of differentiated integration was basically structured along three phases. First, we have constructed a methodology to classify different studies that in this year have emerged on a scenario of differentiated integration that Arena did a tremendous work to put together, and you can find all of them together in our website on Differentiated Gate on DICE website. Second, we have tried to conduct an actual mapping of the projection of differentiated integration within these studies against main fault in policy sector within the European Union, but also in relation with different form of integration and differentiation, internal and external. So quite a relevant topic in relation with the challenges of today with Ukraine and the further demand on the future of Europe. Lastly, in the last phase of this DICE project, in this part of the DICE process, we try to test this outcome with policymaker and stakeholder in Brussels through a DICE scenario marathon that was held in October. And the main results now we are further developing in this policy paper that, of course, deals with internal and external part of differentiation. So, what about differentiated integration and Ukraine? That is the topic of our today conversation. I will just make three brief points coming out from our study and our work on these issues. First, it's clear that the war and the ensuing of candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova have represented a dramatic turning point of European history and also of academic debate on differentiated integration, including expectation of scholars on differentiation. This event I have clearly reopen and revitalize the enlargement policy that seems completely dead, and trigger a strong demand for de-differentiation from all EU surroundings, so in new external dimension. Second, this is quite an interesting development, as we can observe an almost complete revolution of academic discussion in relation with differentiation that emerged just since in the last few years, especially in reaction to the traumatic Brexit event. At that time, the main focus and the new wave of study on differentiated integration emerged trying to find ways to make cooperation and further external differentiation possible to accommodate EU relations with third countries. Now that word somehow has gone. It does not exist. The world has put us in front of different reality with which we should be confronted. And so if we want all this oblige both the EU and third country to be much less ambivalent I mean, there is no more space for constructing ambiguities, nor from the EU partners. They are or with the EU or against it, but also from the EU itself, that we have seen how, ineffective have been EU policy towards its surrounding, especially when it uses constructive, was called a constructive ambiguity, being it with Turkey, being it with Serbia and Kosovo, being it or with Eastern neighborhood. And so this, I don't think that will be possible in the future. It will be much, much less space for this. Third, and my last point, if all this holds true, the key question is today how to make this new process working, because we know it will be long and difficult. And now we have a momentum for cohesion within the EU. We see the June European Council voting for giving accession candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova. But of course, it won't be easy to transform this in an actual process of the differentiation. So the formal accession of this country into the European Union. And so the key challenge is how to make this process sustainable, effective, and legitimate, and maintaining these three characteristics for a long period of time. And this is not very easy. But I think in that respect, all the work done in this year on differentiated external differentiation, differentiated cooperation with third country could be useful, because not as a landing point to find alternative to full membership, now I don't think it's possible, but to find way to make and reform the enlargement process in a way that it is more effective. And this will be, I think, the key. And I think in this sense also we have to read the debate on the European political community. But I will stop here because I think my 5 minutes have finished.
Great, thank you. Lots of food for thought that, and as I sometimes only half-jokingly say, there is also destructive ambiguity, and I think constructive ambiguity often has been. Svetlana, I think you would want to focus a little bit on the energy aspects, which is a very crucial one.
Yes, that's
for
right.
reconstruction.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this a very topical discussion, very important for my homeland. And I would like to emphasize that reconstruction of Ukraine and also EU approximation will have benefits for both sides. And I would like to focus on a few directions of how the future development will look like in terms of cooperation between the EU and Ukraine. First of all, it is electricity markets, because as you know, Ukraine has successfully Ukrainian energy system was successfully integrated with the European network of transmission system operators for electricity and CERV. And this gives a new player for the EU, and there have been also the electricity experts to the EU, and they were just terminated recently in October just because of the severe shelling that the Russian Federation was, causing our electricity infrastructure. But there is a great potential in continuing the exports of electricity to the EU in the future, and the transmission system operator of Ukraine is trying hard to enlarge, to negotiate with the EU the enlargement of the volumes of transportation of the electricity to the EU. There's also revitalizing of the renewables sector, which is also very important for Ukraine's, ambitions, the green ambitions of Ukraine. And despite the fact that 90% of this sector has been destroyed during the war operations, there is still a great potential, because this industry in Ukraine developed quite dramatically before the war. As of the mid of 2021, the total capacity has reached 9 gigawatts, and that was 15% of the total energy balance of Ukraine. And also within recent 10 years, the volume of investment into this industry has exceeded 10 billion euros. There's also gas market, reducing dependence on the imported gas. And this is true for European Union, and that's true for Ukraine. And since the beginning of war, the natural gas consumption has decreased by 40% in Ukraine, and the demand is being met mainly by the domestic production. So this is also an opportunity to facilitate the domestic production and do not rely on the imports anymore, because Ukraine is so rich of the gas deposits. But of course, a lot of the projects have been put on hold, unfortunately, because of the military operations on our territory. There's also hydrogen industry, which is a very promising sphere of cooperation between EU and Ukraine. Unfortunately, this is a little bit a weak case for Ukraine, but the research is underway to explore the possibility of the low-carbon hydrogen production, also competitive price and supply routes. Ukraine has already been identified as a key partner of the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, and to participate in the future supply and hydrogen projects. There's also one more sphere, which is combating the climate change and reducing the gas house GHG emissions. You might have known that Ukraine has presented its second nationally determined contribution aimed at reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by 65% by 2030, as compared to 1990. And actually, the electricity mixture or electricity mix in Ukraine is mainly a low carbon, because it mostly depends on the nuclear production and also hydro electricity, and also the renewables renewables. So the green energy transition was one of the strategic priorities of the EU and Ukraine before the war, and I should have to emphasize that Russian invasion has made this approach even more urgent. Ukraine has announced its firm commitment to cooperate with the EU in line with the Green Deal goals, as long as the military operations continue and there is destruction and the power grids are being destructed, there is still an opportunity to move forward after the military conflict is over. Of course, there is a big destruction to our energy infrastructure, and in order to make a vital plan for revitalization, technical audits are needed in order to evaluate the actual losses, because as you know, there is a recovery plan for Ukraine that was laid out in Lugano, and it was like 750 billion worth, which is of course including also the green transition, which was worth of 130 billion. Of course, it requires careful reviewing in order to give an unbiased evaluation for the international financial institutions and also the partners. So the recovery process would not be possible without participation of European partners providing unprecedented financial, military, humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, which has so far reached more than 15 billion euros. And I will be, pleased to answer the questions. And so that I will just.
Great, thank you,
this is it.
Svetlana. So, Torbjörn, we've heard a lot about sort of the requirements, the conditions, the wishes. So how do we go about this reconstruction of Ukraine?
Yes, that's the at least maybe $750 billion question, I guess, that we just heard. But I think, to be a little bit more serious, reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be one of the most important questions that we have to deal with in all sorts of science and policy spheres and business environments, etc., etc. So I think it's important that we start, of course, this discussion here today. At the same time, I think we always, when we do this, we have to remind ourselves that the longer it takes for Ukraine to win this war, the costlier this reconstruction is going to be. It's a very trivial point, I know that, but it really means that we need to invest all the resources available here today to make Ukraine end this war sooner rather than later. So in terms of cost saving, win-win, call it whatever we want, you know, this should be number one priority as long as the war goes on. It really needs to stop, to just stop the damage and, you know, make us get a reasonable sort of final bill on what the reconstruction itself is going to be costing Ukraine, us, and everyone else that want to contribute to this process. At the same time, I think it's really important that we have the discussion about reconstruction here today, because we don't want to sit around and then one day the war is over. Let's say that someone in the Kremlin falls down a stair in February and someone else comes in and thinks this war is pretty stupid. We want the plan to be ready there and then to start the reconstruction in Ukraine. So, you know, we need to keep both of these ideas in our head together. Funding now to end the war, make a good, sound, solid plan for the reconstruction that is ready once we can see this being an opportunity. I've been doing quite a lot of the work myself in a group of economists that have published reports on the CPR platform, and we are now going to publish a book developing the policy paper that's called The Blueprint for Reconstruction of Ukraine. It's now going to become a book that's going to be out there next week. And we provide a lot of details in terms of both, you know, the EU processes, the governance structures, how we can deal with corruption, how we can deal with the business climate. I think it's by now 16, 17 chapters detailing a lot of these different issues. So if you have the patience to read a big book next week, this may be one of the things to pick up. But again, so if we go back to the question, how should we think about the plan? I think it's important to come back to the point that was already made, that we need a freestanding agency fully devoted to the reconstruction of Ukraine. This is going to be a long-term process. We do not want to mix it up with discussions in EU's other sort of bodies or at the World Bank or at the EBRD. Just like with the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, this needs to be a freestanding agency. It should, of course, have the Ukrainian government there putting forward their priorities of what should be reconstructed and how. And then the donor community should gather there together to make this plan in sync with the Ukrainian government. And of course, this also addresses an issue that always comes up when you talk about support to Ukraine, which is unfortunately rule of law and corruption and the history that Ukraine has in this area. I think it's just very important that as a general guiding principle to remove opportunities for corruption in any country, and that of course also goes for reconstruction of Ukraine. So within this agency, there should be a lot of focus on making the plans, but then of course checking that the plans that have been presented and funded are actually implemented. If we say that we're going to build 10 schools in a certain district in Kiev, of course we then go and find out that the 10 schools are there and used and functional, you know, at the reasonable cost and all of these things. So, you know, add a layer of monitoring and following up and auditing instead of making, you know, I think the international donor community is a little bit known for having endless processes before you can start any project. Here we would argue that make this process ahead of projects a little bit shorter, but focus a lot of your efforts on the monitoring and auditing and making sure that things were done the way they were supposed to have been done. I want to also maybe go back to a little bit who is going to pay for the reconstruction. We have now seen that this discussion about using the frozen Russian assets is there, and just for those not aware of the numbers here, we're talking about 320 billion or so of frozen Russian assets in the West. We can put this in context. So you have this massive 750 billion discussion at one end. We also have our colleagues at the Kyiv School of Economics that just look at the infrastructure damage. It's a much more narrow measure, but then we're talking about 130 billion. The World Bank says something in the order of 350 billion. So I just think we need to remind ourselves that if we can actually get these Russian assets, that would be a significant chunk to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine. So we should not just let people say it's impossible. I really think this should be sort of the go-to solution. Then we need to complement it with grants from donors. We cannot tell Ukraine, come here and borrow money, borrow money. The Ukrainian economy before this war was less than 200 billion US dollars GDP for 1 year. They already have debts on their books. We cannot tell them to get more debts on the books in the reconstruction process. It really needs to be Russian assets, donor grants, and then of course private sector investments, because Ukraine has the potential to really become a growth market in the European Union. So this should be presented as an attractive case for investor once all of these reforms that we have been discussing here have taken place. And I think, as we also heard, the energy sector would of course be a very natural part to be part of sort of the green transition, not only for Ukraine but for Europe as a whole. So that would be sort of the general thinking of this. And I want to really stress what also Fredrik was saying here, that we can talk about, you know, the costs and the risks with sending all of this money to Ukraine, but we really need to understand what is the alternative of not sending this money, not taking these risks. It's something far, far worse. So if there was ever a cost-benefit calculation, that's pretty easy to understand. If there was ever a simple win-win case to be presented, you know, funding Ukraine, making it a prosperous country that can enter the EU, that should really be our first priority in all of these discussions right now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot of things to chew on. I'd just like to pick up on the relationship between reconstruction of Ukraine and the EU enlargement and EU approximation. And it would seem to me that they are logically very tightly sort of interlinked, because you're also, what we're reconstructing Ukraine into is a prospective future EU member, and also with the EU norms and standards and adopting the acquis. And we've heard we need to mobilize these resources, Russian frozen assets or not. There needs to be a mobilization. There will need to be public funding, grants, loans, but also there will need to be private investments, trade, and so forth. So how are these, all these funds going to be mobilized? And will anyone do this kind of investment in Ukraine if we don't see that Ukraine is on a path that has a European perspective? So is there a risk that we get caught here in a catch-22 where politicians in Europe will not be able to agree on EU enlargement and also not prepared to make the necessary adjustments on how EU does this to allow Ukraine to do this? Or can we think of reconstruction without a future Ukrainian EU membership? Just quick, if you have any quick reactions to this, any one of you.
Yeah.
Matteo.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very difficult to conceive any possible path without the enlargement policy. I mean, we have seen also in this year, for instance, to take a different example with the Western Balkans. I mean, despite all the problem we had in the supply side of integration for this country, we have seen how within the I mean, really linked to the challenge of interdependence. I mean, the policy coordination of their national policy with EU policy have increased massively in the last 10 years. And despite integration didn't formally advance with most countries of the region, still the level of policy coordination incredibly increased because we had to face common challenges. This was evident for the 6 Western Balkan countries. It will be even more evident with Ukraine that there will simply not be enough resources, and really the policy challenge that will be faced will need a strong coordination. So an enlargement policy that is not only focused on the alignment of acquis, that of course is has been the predominant part of your session so far, but also a lot of more policy coordination between what we do within the EU and what the enlargement candidate do, even before a session. So a synchronization and national coordination of policy through common resources. I think, it's simply inevitable because there is such a huge demand for that, that we have to work to find the best political condition to realize this in the less costly way. But
yeah, I think that when it comes to the enlargement process, the EU still wants to stick to the regional approach, no? And we see that, and I'm not sure that this approach makes any sense anymore because we see differentiated paths within the regions, let alone within Eastern Partnership countries, and the decision that was made by the EU to grant Ukraine and Moldova with the candidature status and Georgia only with the European perspective, just as a demonstration that the countries have different stories in their way to implement the reforms. There is a different speed of implementation of the reforms. I think it's their way towards the EU integration. It's not about the competition. So the EU approach should be really merit-based in this case, and Ukraine should not wait to Georgia or Moldova. The same is true, for example, when we make like the comparative analysis between Moldova, Ukraine, and some Western Balkan countries. No, for example, the association agreement signed by Ukraine and Moldova, it's a document about 1,000 pages. And with the implementation of association agreements, especially if Ukraine succeeds to implement rule of law and judiciary reform, the EU will find itself in front of reality where with the implementation of association agreements, these countries have satisfied 70% of the acquis. So in this case, then it will find itself, the ball will be on the EU side, and the question is that whether there will be a political willingness to go beyond the technicalities and to decide really for more serious paths, which would be actual enlargement of the EU.
Torbjörn?
I just wanted to stress again this idea of we need to provide some upfront financing for basically Ukraine, of course, but I think in more general terms. The fact that countries join the EU at a significantly lower income level than the other countries that are already in the Union creates a lot of tension once they join the EU. I know that's a bit harsh and it's about, you know, as an economist you have to be careful how much you want to stress economics, but I just think that, you know, it's in our own interest to have prosperous neighbors that enter the Union and not make them come in, you know, just at the lowest possible level. So this idea that you get much more funds once you're in the EU, I think is very backward. It doesn't really make sense at all. So, you know, if there's a time to change how we think about what the financing available is for different types of countries, you want to spend the money before countries enter. Of course, with all sorts of conditionality that we know about.
I mean, so there are huge tasks ahead. We need to find a way to move further the enlargement process, and we need to mobilize funds. Are European leaders and European electors prepared for this?
Don't look at me, I'm a recipient country.
Or will history, so to say, I mean, because history is moving whether we like it or not now, and Ukraine and the Russian-Ukrainian war is a sort of the locomotive of history. But will we be dragged into this Europe by necessity, or is there a way that the European leaders can take leadership and proactively actually be in charge, in control of this historical development?
You know, I can make only the Italian example now, and we saw that ex-premier Draghi was one insisting initially to grant Ukraine with the candidate status, and if you look at the public opinion in Italy and all the political debates, we see that the population favors Ukraine's integration into the EU, but not in the NATO, and sees it as an opportunity or instrument to resolve the conflict, because they have this naive kind of idea of Russia that Russia opposes only the NATO while it's perfectly happy with the EU, but the EU is really an instrument from them to bring peace to Ukraine. So in that sense, I don't think that Italian public opinion will ever make problems for the enlargement when it comes to Ukraine, and I think the same is true also for Western Balkans.
Can I just make a reflection from here in Stockholm? But our Minister for Development Cooperation just said that Ukraine is going to be sort of the top priority for Swedish development cooperation. So, I mean, that's one signal. We have von der Leyen saying that we should seriously think about seizing the Russian assets. We have, you know, the Nordic Baltics going to Kiev. I mean, that's some pretty good signals, I hope.
Matteo?
I mean, if Ukraine looked like Switzerland today, that we would have no problem in accepting them. So I think their key issue will be, and if it will look like, and the other way around, if it wouldn't need so much the enlargement process if it looks as Switzerland. But if we have an effective, this is why we need to have an effective enlargement process that is able really to somehow not only stabilize but also transform and make this country converge. And of course, differentiated integration in the sense of, for instance, opening cohesion funds before accession could be a key instrument to allow this process of convergence even before full formal membership. So somehow to better balance the benefits and cost of integration process, because it will be long, and we have seen how somehow now is all the benefits comes after you access, and this just does not work so well for countries that are not able to have a fast track into the EU as some had in the past.
Svetlana, I mean, we are faced with multiple challenges in the energy field. Russians are doing the best to bomb destroy all of the infrastructure.
Yes, that's right. And also, but nevertheless,
But we
yeah.
also have problems, and some of these are domestic in Europe, so to say. I mean, not all of the high energy prices and the problems we have with energy are related to. I mean, there was an Energiewende in Germany, and nuclear power has been shut down. And at the same time, we are building wind power, and we should have a green transition and everything. Does this equation really is it solvable? Can we square this circle? And you talked about a win-win, so to say, that there's a mutual benefit, but how long do we have to wait for the wins of that? Because right now, European consumers, the newspapers in Sweden, I think in many countries, are full of high energy prices and how to deal with this. An enormous amount of taxpayers' money now are spent on covering the higher energy prices. At the same time, we have an inflation. So.
Yes,
right now, it seems pretty dark, so to say.
Yeah, the green transition has been challenged, and we can see it, and also, but European Union is trying hard to put together certain measures in order to help consumers and also businesses, and also trying to put some price caps, which is probably not very a usual thing for European Union, and also some of the some countries has also resort to to reopening their coal mines, and maybe just reconsidering their policy of using the nuclear power plants just in order to overcome this energy crisis. But I don't think that this affects very much the green transition is irreversible in that way, in that sense. And also Ukraine has been also committed to the green transition, and it has been doing a lot of creating a lot of internal strategies and documents in order to go in line with the European Green Deal. And I hope that the war, of course, it has been destroying the electricity or energy infrastructure, but at the same time, we have an opportunity to reshape our energy mix and also our energy infrastructure. Like the thermal generation has been affected very much. That they have been shelling our thermal power plants most of all, but thermal generation constitutes only 30% of the whole energy mix. So thermal generation will be substituted by the renewables in the future, and we have a big potential for renewables. At the same time, Ukraine is also has to do again the homework, trying to do its best to liberalize the energy markets. It is electricity market and also the gas market, because there's still a lot of distortions between the segments of the markets, energy markets in Ukraine. And I'm talking not only about price caps and also administrative regulation, but I'm also talking about the public service obligation, which still exists in both electricity market and also gas market, and it doesn't make, of course, doesn't allow to make a progress in reforms on the energy sector. So, but finally, the green transition will be performed anyway.
Very short, we also need to.
Yeah, I'm just going to say one very simple thing, which is conserving energy should be like priority number one. Before we start thinking about how we can add production, just conserve as much as possible. In Sweden, 25% reduction in the southern parts is what they talk about now. So.
Good. It's high time to let the audience put questions or comments. I think we will have time for 1 or 2 rounds, and I think we will take 2 or 3 questions at a row, and here we go. So the gentleman there, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Jakob Sjöwall. I am the representative of the Swedish Parliament in Brussels. I was thinking of picking up on the question of enlargement and the future of Europe. In September, the German Chancellor Scholz made the case in a speech at the Charles University in Prague that if the EU in a foreseeable future will grow quite substantially, that needs to be coupled with treaty reform. I would like to, basically hear your reflections on this idea. Is it realistic? Is it needed? And what would that sort of entail? And what's the reasoning behind this? Thank you.
We had a question, gentleman over there.
Thank you. Frank Schimmelpfennig, ETH Zurich. I have one question for Matteo. Could you tell us a little bit more about, say, the results of this in this differentiation scenario marathon? I mean, you've spoke a lot about, say, a more effective enlargement policy, but I'd be curious to hear what this scenario building has actually presented in that respect. And I guess a question for the others. I mean, are there any projections on what the massive outmigration out of Ukraine means for the prospects of reconstruction, especially now as the war continues? Are there any, say, projections about brain drain and other issues that might have an impact?
Very good. And we had a third question there.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Eric Jones. I'm director of the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute. First, I want to say this is an awesome panel, so thank you guys so much for all of that. I have two very specific questions. Nana, you made a point about the achievement of the acquis communautaire under the association agreements. I was just at DG NEAR, and I got a very different impression from them about the level of convergence in that particular aspect. So if you could explain that to me, that would be great. And the second thing, I guess I have a deep concern. There's a deep skepticism in the European Commission right now about sustained derogations in the enlargement process. They don't want to bring member states in the differentiated way, Matteo, that you were suggesting. How do we overcome that? Because if we bring them in with sustained derogations, that also doesn't work. Look at Bulgaria and Romania. It makes me very nervous.
So good questions. Appetite for treaty reform, anyone? The role of migration, I think, is a very important one, and the brain drain. The association agreement and the DCFTA, how well have they been implemented or not? And the various views, fantastic ideas on differentiation and certain institutional resistance to this, and some more specific questions. So maybe we just do start with Donna and work.
Okay, then I will last with the very last question. I did not say that Ukraine has implemented association agreement. What I meant was that the provisions inside the association agreement repeats a lot of conditions set by acquis, and if Ukraine implements association agreements fully, it turns out that it has already implemented 70% of acquis. Of course, now we are far away from that goal. I want to just underline this, the difference between association agreements that has been signed between the EU and the Balkan countries, because in terms of conditions and provisions are completely different, and that ones that the EU signed with Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. On massive migration, so there was like the first wave migration since the war started, but then we saw also the people going back to Ukraine, and then since September the things changed, and it was linked to Russia announcing mobilization when Ukraine prohibited even the students to leave the country and ask those who are studying abroad to back home in Ukraine. So I think it will be difficult to measure the level of brain outflow of the country, but still, I hope that this precedent that when they saw that Ukraine counter-offensive operations have been successful and this motivated them to come back, then after the war, if Ukraine succeeds, I mean, they will go back to Ukraine.
Matteo, differentiated reform treaty maybe?
I mean, treaty reform, of course, is fundamental, but maybe, I mean, there are also other means. I would say under the broader chapter of institutional reform. I mean, we know there are passerelle clause and everything, but of course it will be fundamental, especially passing to qualified majority voting in some key aspect, for instance, foreign policy and so on. This would be extremely important, not only for the functioning of the EU, but also for make enlargement possible. Because, of course, the first counter-argument to enlargement is look at Hungary, look at other countries. And, of course, if you have key policy deciding through majority voting, qualified majority voting, also, I mean, problem in individual country would be not so detrimental for the entire union as they are today. So this would easy also, I think, enlargement. And of course, derogation maybe is a little bit linked with that, but I mean, we have seen that they do not work. So this is one reason more why we should do much more before a session. And we can do that. So because we know that when a session is credible, is a powerful instrument. Right. And there we can make demands that works. And we see, I mean, we have asked many different things that maybe to other larger countries that they still somehow were able somehow to trigger some adaptation. The scenario marathon, I will not open this. It's too long to describe what we have done. We have basically tried to use the work done by Arena on collecting through the recent year work on differentiated integration, especially under the category on the future of Europe, and we start to somehow classify and to organize in a little data set projection between the next 5-10 years that were present in different studies, not necessarily on a scenario, but different study on differentiated integration and expectation in the next. And then we use this mapping to make this exercise in Brussels, and we focus on the extreme of positive scenario where integration proceed and the most negative scenario, and we work with policymakers try to understand which are the key factors that could lead to that situation. So it's not really about predicting the future, but it's more about broadening a bit our expectation to get ready to make today policy choice that could be a bit more effective. Mm-hmm. And
we need some political fantasy and yes. Imagination. Svetlana, are there any of the questions you want to pick up on?
Well, this is not my research area, but my colleagues from the think tank in Ukraine were also giving some recommendations how to help Ukraine in this very difficult process, especially when there is 7 million people fled the country and trying to, I don't know, maybe going through very hard times there because there's no opportunity to settle down and also to have plans for the future. But they also think that the funds that they were actually devoted to the refugees abroad could be just maybe given to the people temporarily displaced inside the country in order to help them to find a job and to feel themselves more comfortable, if that's possible under the current circumstances, and also try to think about the temporary jobs for a lot of people who would like to participate in the reconstruction. There is a lot of infrastructure facilities that need to be renovated. So before we think about very global things, we have to get rid of all these ruins that we, have been experiencing recently. So there will be also a good chance to help with the financing this temporary reconstruction work.
Torbjörn?
I just want to say the obvious thing, that it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, the migration and reconstruction. Of course, the 7 million people are needed in the reconstruction, but they actually need to have something to return back home to.
Wow.
So obviously we need to provide at least some minimum basic level of housing. We need to make sure there are employment opportunities, school for the kids, pretty simple things, but
I mean, that has also been a topic of the discussions on enlargement, that one before the actual accession, that Ukraine, a country like Ukraine, could be integrated into the single market and the four freedoms and so forth. But then the question is, how wisely would it be to actually have the free movement of labor, if that's a good place to start or not. We are slowly moving towards the end of this panel, but I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. And I see we start with the lady there, down there, baby.
Thank you very much. My name is Simon Bunze, and I'm the content manager of the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development. It's based at CIPRI. I just have a very short question. How easy or difficult from a legal and political standpoint is it to use the frozen Russian assets? To use the frozen Russian assets. Thank you.
The gentleman down there. Yes, yep. No.
Which one?
Behind, yes.
Okay. Jean-Louis de Brouwer from the Egmont Institute in Brussels. I would like to follow up briefly on the issue of enlargement. Matteo, I heard what you said. Okay, we all know that the outcome of the Conference on the Future of Europe will be presented tomorrow. That the Parliament is advocating for minor treaty changes, and that the member states are just dead against this idea. And this even without referring to enlargement. So, okay, Jim Close is not in this room, but I mean, he always used the same example to show that treaty changes will be needed if we want to process enlargement the good old ways. Can we think 1 second that in the future there would be 7 Western Balkan commissioners and just 1 German one, as an example? So of course treaty changes will be needed, but nobody is ready to engage in that treaty changes. So that leads me to maybe think about an alternative scenario, building upon what you said, Mr. Becker, if I read your name correctly. I mean, let us assume that indeed Ukraine and others are fully implementing their association agreement, and we know that there are different levels of ambition. So they would be close to fully member of the internal market. If we add to that, I mean, massive injection of money before or just as they are, we end up in a situation which was close to the good old Romano Prodi, everything but institutions. Isn't that the future of the EU architecture? All the more, and there is an elephant in the room that nobody ever refers to when talking about enlargement. What about Turkey? Which is still a candidate country, to my knowledge. So why do we disconnect Turkey from Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, or the Western Balkans? They are still in the waiting room, and they have been there for quite a long time.
I think we have to draw a line for the questions here, and then we will have a final round. And I will add another question. The Swedish presidency will be done for the next 6 months. This is at the critical juncture in history, and of course, no one knows how the situation on the ground and the war will develop. And of course, the Swedish presidency has a very limited role in this. But if you could have one single wish of a political decision from the EU within the coming 6 months, what would that top wish be? So we had the questions on the frozen assets and treaty change, and then my question on your wish. If you could write a list to Santa Claus or the Swedish presidency or von der Leyen or Michel or whoever, what would be on top of that list for the next 6 months? Maybe we start from you, Torbjörn, this time and give Nona the last word. So.
Okay, frozen assets, we need to ask the lawyers, I guess. I'm an economist, I don't know these things, so I'll skip that. My Santa wish list thing, number one priority, create a specialized agency for the reconstruction of Ukraine. It should start working already now to coordinate the support that is needed before the war ends, but it should be there ready to move once the war is over.
Svetlana.
The Swedish presidency, in close coordination with the High Representative, should maintain and develop EU support for Ukraine's defense capabilities in order to ensure Ukraine's victory and to minimize human suffering and economic destruction. And this is from also just a common, wish of my colleagues also.
Right.
From
Matteo.
Alternative to reforms. I have this one. I think there are no alternative to reform also within the European Union. I mean, it's overdue. Should have been done probably a year before, and it's not something that we have to do because of enlargement, but is necessary for the functioning of the European Union. And the alternative, I'm not saying that is easier or that is probable, but probably is not the most probable outcome. But then also, I mean, and probably also enlargement is not the most probable, but there are concrete risks of, and we have seen what has happened with Turkey, with the Western Balkans, of have a never-ending enlargement process that little by little lose effectiveness, and we waste a huge amount of power that we have of a lot of demands. We have, the large body is like a genius from the bottle. You have 3 desires that you can ask to the candidate straight. When they are gone, and we really cannot misuse them in this moment, I think. And yes, and the Swedish presidents, I think what did the presidency of Czech Republic, they convened the first EPC meeting. Right. I think something should be done on how to better connect that new format with European institutions. Right. I think this would be the key, and to have some really concrete answer. Also, how to better connect it with the needs of enlargement policy.
Nona?
So about the wish list. Beyond the wish list, I heard that today Anna Grant Kramp-Karrenbauer, it's difficult to pronounce, which was the defense minister of Germany, now she's a state minister for EU relations, if I'm not mistaken, has said that the EU will start accession negotiations with the Ukraine very soon. Let's see.
Okay, very good. We have discussed a lot of big questions for the fate and future of Europe. I think there were expert political pundits that tried to solve the problems of Eastern Europe for the 10-20 last years, who have experimented with all these ideas of grey zones, countries in between, buffered zones or whatever, and I think we have seen that we have to come to an end to that, and the ambiguity was not creative but destructive, and Europe has now to move forward. And maybe, Matteo, maybe the EU is a little bit what Churchill said about the Americans once, that once we've exhausted all other possibilities, we will do the right thing, so to say. And maybe historically that what's happened. And I also want to extend a warm thank for all of those who have watched this online. And thank you very much for coming here. And let's give our speakers a warm round of applause.